Welcome to part 2 of the Physical Activity Epidemiology Research podcast. As a reminder, our objectives for this lesson are to define epidemiology, and we define epidemiology as the study of the distribution and determinants of health-related states or events in specified populations, and the application of this study to the control of health problems. And we did some defining, so that was the physical activity measurements. We talked about distribution, which is frequency and the rates of disease and those type of things. And we looked at some different physical activity measures so far. A lot of those we should already be aware of. And then this study we're going to look at epidemiological study designs. What's the methods that we'll use? Then we'll talk about reading and interpreting physical activity epidemiological studies. Okay, so how do we measure or assess physical activity? The two common ways are going to be questionnaires and direct measures. Questionnaires we've talked about in the past in the previous chapters. The textbook talks about 3 basic types of questionnaires: global, short recall, and quantitative. And each one of these has different purposes and different lengths. The global is pretty short, just trying to get a big picture. That's why they call it global. It's big picture things. Short recall, it can have 5 to 15 items. It can be your typical Likert type scaled 1 to 5 type questionnaire. And quantitative can be a little bit longer. That provides a little bit more detail. It can have open-ended and closed-ended questions. And again, this is self-reported data, so we're basing on what each individual tells us about their physical activity and looking for patterns in their physical activity. We define a group of individuals that we're trying to find out about their physical activity. Now, the other way we can assess physical activities through direct measurements. This can be used. We use this quite a bit now in some of our PE classes, is with heart rate monitors and pedometers. The pedometers is how many measures your steps. And actually, my wife was taking part. I'm not sure if it was a study at Children's Hospital or if it was a work-related deal. I'm not really too sure of all the details behind it, but I believe for either a month or 2 she wore a pedometer at work, or all day actually, to see how many steps she would walk in a week. The goal was to have those people in the study to walk a minimum of 10,000 steps a week. And so what she would do is put her pedometer on when she woke up in the morning and wore it until she went to bed, and wrote down the number of steps she walked every single day and kept a log of that to determine how active she was, and along with the other people there at Children's Hospital. So that's a good example of direct measures of physical activity. Actually, it's going to be a little bit better than the questionnaire, just because we're actually finding out exactly how many steps, for example, how active a person really is with the direct measures. And the questionnaires, it's really based on what the person thinks they're doing versus what they are actually doing. So now we're going to talk about the different study designs. There's going to be 3 study designs: descriptive epidemiology, analytical epidemiology, and experimental designs. We're going to start with descriptive epidemiology. Again, there's 2 types of descriptive epidemiology: cross-sectional designs and ecological designs. The purpose of descriptive epidemiology is is to make general observation about the disease patterns and characteristics. Just like in our descriptive research, we're just trying to describe what's going on in the population. So objective is to quantify specific health problems, identify population subgroups that may have higher rates of disease, and develop hypothesis about specific factors that may be risk factors of the disease. We're going to use information that is easily obtainable or inexpensive and does not require too much time to do this. Now, for one of the things you're going to do for the learning activity is read 2 articles, and these articles are from the National Athletic Trainers Association's journal, the Journal of Athletic Training. It was a study conducted by the NC2A to look at injury patterns in their sports, I believe over a 15-year period or so. And so this is a descriptive epidemiology study because it's just taking the data that's there and describing what's going on. So let's see what's the difference between the cross-sectional designs and ecological designs. Now, cross-sectional tries to determine a relationship between physical activity and health outcomes. So we're looking at a cross-section of people. How do we look across a bunch of different groups of people here? So we're looking at the for example, we'll look at the physical activity on cardiovascular disease risk factors. We'll assemble 2 groups of subjects, a highly active group of subjects and a low active group of subjects. In those groups, the low active or a sedentary group, low active group would be our control group. So like we talked in experimental design, we'd have one group do experiment, another group not do an experiment. Well, there's no experiment here. We're just measuring what they actually do. We're not testing, we're not causing them to go through any kind of experiment. We're just measuring what they actually do. They're already reported, self-reported, highly active, and we have another group that's self-reported, sedentary or low active group of people. Then what we do is measure the cardiovascular risk factors such as cholesterol levels, percent body fat, and any other ones we identify. And then we compare the mean scores between the 2 groups and see what's the difference between them. You can read on page 310 about this. They have a really good example of a cross-sectional designs in our area. They do a better job explaining it than I can. Our next descriptive epidemiology design is called ecological designs. And here we use existing data for disease and exposure to compare and contrast rates of disease by specific characteristics of a population. Again, the textbook on pages 310 and 311, the authors do a better job of explaining this than I can, and I'd just be repeating what they say. So I'm going to allow you to go ahead and read that. Again, descriptive epidemiology is just like descriptive research that we talked about earlier in this class. It's just taking the data that's there and describing what's going on. And you'll see that in the NC2A articles that you'll read. They've taken the data, they've found an injury, they're looking at injury rates, which would be frequency over the years, what injuries were more common than the other ones, more prevalent than the other ones. And then they're going to draw some kind of conclusions based on that data. And so that's what we do with the descriptive epidemiology. Now, the analytical designs, we have 2 different types. We have cohort designs and case study designs. What we do with the analytical design is we test a hypothesis like an experimental design. We're looking for cause and effect links between exposure rates, mortality rates, and incidence outcomes using observational methods. So we're just, again, we talked about observational studies in our descriptive chapter. We're just looking at the data. We're looking at the people. We're not doing an experiment here. There's no experimental design here. But we are testing a hypothesis based on data that we are given. And we are using people here. So we have two kinds again. We got cohort and case study. So cohort studies, we have a large group of, I'm going to go ahead and go groups exposed to cause of disorder versus those not exposed. So we have a group of people. Relative frequency of exposure and non-exposure is known. We know what's the frequency level of a particular disorder. A sample of cohorts selected from population and groups into cases and non-cases here. So we have a large disease-free population is defined, and the assessment of relative exposures are obtained. So we have this group, we have cohorts, which, like you guys in the program are in a cohort, a group of students, a group of people. We can get a baseline measurement for each subject. So we know whatever the risk factors that we're looking at, we get a baseline measurement. Then we're going to follow that group or cohort over time, or a particular amount of time. Depends on the study. We can say 2 years, we can say 6 months, we can say for the rest of their life if it's a longitudinal study. And then we measure those particular risk factors that are known problems, and then if somebody I don't want to use the word catch a disease, that's not right too, becomes infected or develops a particular disease, then that is an incident and it's rated, and we look at their lifestyle, look at the different risk factors, and then we try to compare the different people to see if different risk factors made a difference in their mortality rates or their frequency of disease rates, or did it decrease or increase, all those type of things. So cohort, a group of people. Now, case control studies, we select participants from a group with a disorder and compare with cases without the disorder. So the case with the disease and those without the disease are called the control. The ones without the disease are the control. That's why it's case control. And the case are, again, the individuals with the disease, and the control are those individuals without the disease or the disorder. And we're going to follow those. It's very similar to cohort studies, and we're trying to determine factors that are related to a particular disease. How do these people with the disease differ than people who do not have the disease? I have a hard time seeing the difference here. So we have different types of case control and cohort designs. We have retrospective. We look back from effects to potential causes. People already have the disease, and we look back and try to find out what's the different causes of that particular disorder or disease. Perspective, we want to identify an event and follow the cases forward form that's supposed to be from that event for some period. And so, for example, let's say all these fires that are, well, let's say 9/11, when all that smoke and ashes were happening there in New York City. That's an event. That's a time that we know a lot of individuals were exposed to a to a bad thing with all the smoke and inhalation of the all the different junk that was in the air that day and the days following that, and we can follow forward to see what the health of those individuals are like. And another one I can think of with this is Gulf War I, with all the different stuff that was going on in the air when all the refineries are on fire. I had a friend that was there, and he's had some serious health problems because of that. And so we identify an event and follow those people forward and see what happens with them. And cross-sectional is measure cause and effects at a certain point and look for relationships. We talked about that with cross-sectional designs. We're just looking at different groups of individuals and see what the relationships are like. So we've talked about descriptive epidemiological studies, we've talked about analytical studies. Now we're going to talk about experimental designs with randomized trials. This is like other experimental design. We have random selection and we have random assignments into groups. So we have experimental and control groups. The difference is that we cannot withhold any kind of necessary treatments for these patients, these people, because that would be unethical. You got to make sure people get their medicines and stuff like that. So examples are clinical trials and community trials. So in clinical trials, we have randomized trials focused on changing health at the individual level. So this can be in a lab, or it can be just small groups of individuals where we want to see the effect of. This one is similar to epidemiological studies, except here we actually have a control group. We're going to take that group and see if we do particular physical activities for a period of time, just like we've done in our research methods. If we have a group of cancer patients, one group goes and we randomly select them, randomly assign them to groups. We take one group and we do cardiorespiratory fitness program for a certain amount of time. We do take another group and we do strength program for a certain amount of time, and then one group they don't do anything, and see if there's a difference between the groups. So their mortality rates different and frequency of cancer coming back and all those type of things. So that's a clinical trial. Community trials focus on changing the health of the community. These can be community-wide programs to see if a community's health can be changed. Then what they would do is they would compare, let's say Fresno, say we got 500,000 people on a proper Fresno in Clovis. They would say we started some kind of health initiative here in Fresno area. And they would compare us to a control group of another similar population, similar characteristics of our community, similar socioeconomics and way we're developed, approximately 500,000, same everything, and see if there's any differences between the two communities in the long run. Again, the textbook does a pretty good job talking about these two, the clinical trials and the community trials. So those are, we have the three different types. We have descriptive, analytical, and experimental designs. The difference between analytical and experimental designs, again, is analytical is not really developing a research study. There's no experiment here. We're in experimental design. There is actually an experiment. You're testing. We're developing some kind of experiment, some intervention with that group. Analytical, you're not. You're just taking the data that's there.